Well, hello and welcome to Insight, everyone, with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters. In the aftermath of the Second World War, nations gathered together to establish and reinforce rules that were designed to prevent the repetition of such awful conflict. The four Geneva Conventions have stood the test of time for most of the 20th century, but they've come increasingly under pressure over the last two decades. From Syria to Ukraine and now Gaza, the laws of war are being flouted with reckless abandon, one might say. We look at those conflicts, starting with Ukraine and then Gaza. We're joined by Marc Garlasco. He's a former Pentagon targeting expert turned human rights investigator, and he joins us now from his car. And the reason for this is he's actually just come out of hospital, and we're very lucky to have him. Marc, first of all, just say what's happened to you, because we weren't planning to do it like this.
Yeah, I'm terribly sorry. So I had this accident with my hand, and this morning I was supposed to get my stitches out, and they had to change the time for my appointment. And then, as it goes with the hospital, I got in, and the doctor was about an hour late getting to me, and so we're ending up having to start like this. But as soon as I get to the house, we'll be able to go to the laptop. But I also want to assure your viewers, my daughter is driving, so there's no concerns as far as safety.
Right. Okay. Great. Well, listen, it's really good to have you with us. I mean, I know you from some time back. I worked briefly with Human Rights Watch, and you were working there too as a weapons expert and advisor. And I did work in Gaza, and you were way back then were providing advice on Gaza. So it's very good to have you with us. In a moment, I know that at some point you're going to jump out of your car and head back up to your apartment, and we may play a short video from the International Committee for the Red Cross about the sort of key 3 or 4 principles of the laws of war, which is really the standard by which I think your investigations are sort of held. Well, those are the main principles, at least. So we might play that in a second. But first of all, Marc, how did you get into this? What's your own background?
Yeah, so I basically started in the Pentagon and a targeting professional. Gosh, it's really hard for me to even discuss. You start as a child, you get your education, and we're very much taught in the U.S. About the military and whatnot. And I thought that this would be a great, career to go into. And I went into targeting, and, I felt that as I was doing the work, I was there for almost 7 years, and I became chief of high value targeting in the Pentagon, chasing after Saddam Hussein. And I felt that, solving problems with high explosives was not the best way to do it, and that perhaps there were better options. And I found, luckily, Human Rights Watch. And I went there, and then I worked for Human Rights Watch for a number of years in many conflicts, investigating different violations of the laws of war in Afghanistan, Gaza, in the war in Georgia in 2008, for example, and did a number of conflicts there. Then I went into the United Nations. In the UN, I led the war in Afghanistan, and then Libya. And then I did Syria for the UN. And now I'm working for PAX, which is a Dutch NGO. It's one of the largest Dutch NGOs. And at PAX, I'm doing a number of things. One, I'm working with both the US military, NATO, and the United Nations on a new civilian harm policy, right, to try to assist them when they have operations so that civilians are not unduly harmed. And I'm also working on some projects with the Dutch military, and also our offices in South Sudan and in Iraq, and various things with the UN missions there. So I get around a bit.
Yeah, no, that's a huge experience there. You've really mentioned most of the big conflicts of our time. Can you we'll move towards Ukraine now? I know that you've been working with training teams in Poland, Ukrainian teams in Poland, to investigate war crimes by themselves. So they've got the ability to do by themselves. Can you talk a bit about that? And then we'll talk about the kind of crimes that they would be investigating or that you investigated. But first of all, tell us about that project in Poland.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also just want to let you and your viewers know, with great apologies, we've hit a spot of traffic, but we're doing our best. So at any rate, the Institute for International Criminal Investigations, which is in The Hague, has been hired by the Ukrainian police and defense forces to provide war crimes training for the various war crimes trainers in Ukraine. And what we do is they bring in different teams with specialties, different individuals like myself that have deep specialties, and we work with the Ukrainian team. So, for example, I do the weapons training. We have a sexual and gender-based violence specialist. We have someone who is on the Srebrenica team who talks and teaches them about going into different areas and pulling out, cadavers, et cetera, trying to identify who has been killed in mass graves and how to collect all of the evidence and the information at the standards of, international standards, so it can be used in different war crimes cases.
If we were to focus in on your area of expertise, which is about the use of weapons and also the employment of military tactics, can you talk about the kind of incidents that those Ukrainian teams would have to be investigated, or perhaps incidents that you yourself have been investigating?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, for example, when a strike happens in Ukraine, unfortunately, about 90% of the munitions that the Russians are using are unguided, and they're also directly targeting civilians and civilian areas. And so when this happens, you have very high number of civilian casualties, and it's a very dangerous area to go into. So the first thing that I teach them is how to enter an area safely, to work with the deminers and the Ukrainian military to ensure that it's safe for them to begin the investigation, that they then have to cordon off the area, go in, locate the remnants of the weapons, conduct their discussions, the interviews with victims and witnesses to understand what has happened at the site, and basically put together a holistic case of what has happened at that individual site. Now, it's very interesting. In the amount of time that I've been working with them, from the beginning up until now, they have put together over 8,000 war crime cases, wow, which is just a staggering number. And that's of course not just the military attacks such as the ones that I look at, but also issues of sexual and gender-based violence, attacks on foodstuffs, et cetera, a wide variety of different crimes. And so, it's quite shocking, but the evidence has to be collected in such a way that it is done at the international level. I'm training Ukrainian police officers, police investigators, and prosecutors who are very skilled investigators, right? And that's important because they know how to do investigations. But what they don't know how to do is how to do a war crime investigation. And so we're specifically teaching them how to do that and how to do it in a situation where your life is in danger. Because, the munitions, obviously, you have unexploded ordnance. They are endangered and can be killed. And so there are certain protocols that they have to follow, first for their own safety, and then so that they can collect them at the level of evidentiary standard that it can be used by the ICC and other potential, international legal organizations.
Okay. Standing back, it would seem, over the last 2 years, there's been a huge amount of focus on this. There's been a very clear realization that war crimes have been committed, and in terms of international coverage of this conflict, it seems very black and white. By and large, Russia has been targeting civilian areas. It has been using force disproportionately, hasn't made any attempts to protect civilians, and in fact, it seems to be doing the reverse by targeting them. Can you just give us an example of? I can think of Izium, I can think of Kramatorsk, I can think of specific examples. Can you just lay out one case where that's happened? I ask this because this moral and legal clarity that we have with Ukraine is not so apparent in terms of our coverage of Gaza. And I want to come on to that in a bit. But let's keep that. I want to talk about those very clear examples in Ukraine first.
Absolutely, sure. So actually, let me give you two examples. So one is the attack on Olenivka, and Olenivka was a prison where the Russians were holding Ukrainian soldiers. Now, when soldiers are being held as prisoners, right, they are hors de combat, they have surrendered, and they are now protected persons. They are considered just like at the same level of protection, right, as a civilian. And so in Olenivka, what happened was there was an explosion at the prison and all of the soldiers that were there were killed. And the Russians stated that this was an attack by the Ukrainians using a HIMARS rocket. They produced photographs of some of the remnants of the rocket, and they also produced photographs of the actual site. Now, I did an investigation at the request of the Ukrainian government, looking at the remnants that the Russians provided and also the photograph of the site. And it's quite shocking. So first of all, the remnants that they provided are unfortunately ones that they had used at other sites. And so it was showing that they were playing a shell game, right? They were taking the same pieces of munitions and using those as an excuse to try to say this is proof of what's happened. But additionally, the visual evidence at the site clearly showed that it did not comport with the type of munition that they were saying it was. And it was, in fact, much more likely that it was a thermobaric weapon, which is something that the Russians use quite widely. So we look at the Olenivka prison. You had a weapon that the Russians stated, which is a high fragmentation weapon. And when you looked at the building, there was a lot of thermal damage. There was no fragmentation damage. The walls were intact. The beds had been melted. The bodies were melted. And none of this was consistent with the type of weapon they were saying. And so this was a clear case in which they were trying to blame someone else for a crime that they had committed. Now, there are other cases where we have direct attacks on civilians, and we also have cases where they're using weapons improperly. So, for example, there is an anti-ship missile that they have been using. Unfortunately, the reason for this is the Russians have been very short on certain precision munitions because they've used a lot, obviously, during the war in Syria. And now that they've transitioned to the war here in Ukraine, they've become very short on munitions. As that happens, they are starting to use weapons improperly. So there's an anti-ship missile, and the way it operates is it goes out into the sea and it searches for the largest piece of metal it can find, right, which is, let's say, an aircraft carrier, and it strikes that. But they're using it against cities. And so we've seen these hitting places such as shopping malls and killing many civilians. The reason is because it looks for the largest structure, which, tends to be a shopping mall or something like that. And these are cases where we are now seeing very high numbers of civilian casualties. And it just shows that the Russians not only are targeting civilians, but also are not taking care in any of the attacks that they're conducting. And so it's quite shocking and sad. But again, like I said, over 8,000 cases have been put together. And I'm hopeful that once this at some time in the future goes to an international justice mechanism, that there will be some level of justice served.
If you look back at Russia's conduct in Syria, this fits a pattern, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And, unfortunately, it seems that they've learned lessons in Syria and they're applying them in Ukraine, but all the wrong lessons, right? The lessons of direct attacks on civilians, attacking foodstuffs. They use, for example, incendiary weapons. Right? They're burning fields. They're also attacking medical personnel. The Russians have begun what's called a double tap strike in Syria, and now they've exported it to Ukraine. So, for example, we see in an attack in certain cities in Syria, medical facilities the attacks are immediately followed up by attacks on medical facilities, and this is so that the Syrians cannot, one, get to the medical facility and get treatment, but also they're killing medical workers who are highly skilled and trained individuals that are very difficult to replace. Now they've exported that to Ukraine, and in Ukraine, what we're seeing is there'll be an attack. Once medical personnel arrive at the site, they will then attack again to kill the medical personnel in Ukraine. And so they've exported these lessons that they've learned, and they're continuing it throughout the war in Ukraine. And it's just incredibly disturbing.
Yeah. I want to shift to Israel and to Gaza. The whole point about the laws of war is that law is a part of life. It's a part of the world. Conflict has existed for 1,000 years, and those laws of war are saying war takes place, and in fact, nations are justified in pursuing wars in many scenarios. Obviously, when we shift to Israel and Gaza, the events of October the 7th, you see the world saying this was horrendous. What Hamas broke, every law of war that was possible. It deliberately targeted civilians. That was his whole sort of modus operandi there. And so it's very clear that Israel has the right under international armed conflict to defend itself. So that's the premise. You already get away from the different premise in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. The concern, obviously, and what I'm going to do now is bring up one graphic here, and I'm just by a point of comparison, I'm going to share this. This is the death toll as of today, and I don't know how close you are to getting to your home, but this is.
I'm almost there. We're almost there.
Almost there. When you're transitioning from the car to your flat, I might play the ICRC's video about the laws of war, which is a useful reference and may give you time to get out of your car and get to your laptop, etc. So this is the death toll as of today. I mean, probably as of yesterday evening, 19,500, and by those counts, over 14,000 women and children. So that's the minimum number of civilians. They're saying that, in terms of men, how many are Hamas fighters, it's hard to say. But the other thing that's noticeable there is 22 hospitals. And I think, looking at reports today, that the last functioning hospital was taken by Israeli forces today. So not one single, as far as I'm aware, not one single civilian hospital still functioning. So there is obviously a huge amount of international concern. So there's a lot to talk about here, Mark, but as an investigator, what are your first things? What are the first things you start looking at? Is it targeting? What do you start looking at?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to just say that absolutely, Israel has the right to defend itself after the horrendous attacks by Hamas, but that right is not an unlimited right. Right. As you so correctly stated, they must follow the laws of war. And of course, we have grave concerns right now that they are, in the least, playing very fast and loose with those laws. And so what I do is I try to understand how those laws may be broken in these instances. And I try to focus in my work, for example, on the types of weapons used. So I was one of the commentators in the very beginning of the conflict on the attack on the hospital, where there was a controversy on whether or not it was an Israeli rocket or whether it was a Hamas rocket. And so I'm looking for the forensic evidence. What does that show us? Because while you have competing claims, one thing you really cannot do is fight against physical pieces of a weapon or forensic evidence at the site. And so that's the first thing I'm going to do. I'm going to look at that forensic evidence and try to see what that tells me. But also, having my former targeting background, right, I'm going to take some of those things into concern. I'm going to look at the types of weapons, the number of weapons, the density of munitions being dropped, how many weapons are being dropped, and what are the targeting decisions that they're making, because we have two issues here, right? We have proportionality and we have distinction. So for your viewers, proportionality is the idea that the civilian harm can not outweigh the military gain. So in any strike, you have to weigh what the harm is going to be that is going to be caused from whatever that gain is. And then secondly, you have to have distinction at all times. So you must be able to distinguish between a military object and a civilian. And so these are why we call on countries, for example, to use precision-guided munitions, right? So they can better have distinction. And I've been doing a lot of work in the last weeks trying to understand precisely what weapons the Israelis are using, the numbers of weapons they're using, what the percentages are that are precision and are not precision. And I very much want to go into all of those details. We are just pulling up to the house. So I am going to break there, ask you to run your video, and then I will reconnect from my laptop and we will begin again.
Excellent. We'll take up on those
thank you to you and your viewers
concepts,
for your understanding.
Yeah. Well, so we're just going to play now. I'll share the screen now, and we're going to play this video. It's 4 minutes long, and it's going to take up at least two of those concepts that Mark mentioned. So the first bit is fairly obvious. So I will jump into the first. Yeah. So here we go. So this is about 10 seconds in.
Have tried to limit the brutality of war. It was this humanitarian spirit that led to the first Geneva Convention of 1864 and to the birth of modern international humanitarian law. Setting the basic limits on how wars can be fought, these universal laws of war protect those not fighting, as well as those no longer able to. To do this, a distinction must always be made between who or what may be attacked and who or what must be spared and protected. Most importantly, civilians can never be targeted. To do so is a war crime.
When they drove into our village, they shouted that they were going to kill everyone. I was so scared. I ran to hide in the bush. I heard my mother screaming. I thought I would never see her again.
Every possible care must be taken to avoid harming civilians or destroying things essential for their survival. They have a right to receive the help they need.
The conditions prisoners lived in never used to bother me. People like him were the reason my brother was dead. He was the enemy and was nothing to me. But then I realized that behind bars, he was out of action and no longer a threat to me and my family.
The laws of war prohibit torture and other ill treatment of detainees.
Can you see me?
Past.
Yep.
Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Given food and water and allowed to communicate with loved ones. This preserves their dignity and keeps them alive.
I'm gonna stop it there because we got Mark back. Hang on a second. So I think there were two things we were talking there at the beginning about, and one was proportionality. But that was the first concept, and the second one you said was distinction. Did you say
distinction? That's right. Yeah.
So on proportionality, it's a hard one because it's about it's a military assessment, it's a commander's assessment whether the ends justify the means. So in other words, if you've got a military target, this is your military objective. What is, it's for you to assess. It's quite hard to make that assessment. So how do you make that assessment in here? I mean, the first thing people are going to say is, look, approaching 20,000 dead. That seems disproportionate, but that's not it's not actually about numbers.
No, not at all. No, we're trying to understand if you're conducting an attack, right? What is the benefit of that attack? What is the military goal of that specific attack? And then what is the civilian cost of that attack? And so let me give you an example from my time doing targeting in Iraq. So during the war in Iraq, we had an actual number, right? So for any strike against Saddam Hussein and his leadership, which are the most important targets in the war, right? And so for that, we had a baseline of 30 civilians. And so for any strike, if upwards of 30 civilians were anticipated to be killed, that was allowed, and we did not need to get additional authorization for it, right? So that was the metric that we used at that time in Iraq for Saddam Hussein. He is the leader of the country. If you kill him, you could end the war. And so we had a very high threshold of 30 people. If we had an attack in which we believed more than 30 would be killed, we had to go directly to either President Bush or Secretary Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense. That is a very high bar, right? And so that shows that that is the level that the U.S. at that time was comfortable with as far as getting the leader of the country. Now, when we transition to looking at Gaza, I think one of the problems that we have is that the Israelis have a very high threshold of accepting civilian harm for what seem to be fairly mid-level Hamas leaders, right? If we take a look, for example, at the strike on the Jabalia refugee camp, the UK-based organization Air Wars, which documents every single airstrike and civilian casualty in wars across the globe, they have documented in that strike 126 civilians killed, where Israel was going after a mid-level Hamas leader. It becomes very difficult for us to comprehend at that point how that level of civilian harm is acceptable for that kind of a target, right? And when militaries put these strikes together and plan them, they put together what's called a collateral damage estimate. And the collateral damage estimate is a look at the building, right, at the target, for example, and they do a model, they build a model within the computer, and they're able to change the types of bombs, the angles the bombs come in, and they also look at what the population is in the area. And based on those different changes and the variables that they put into the computer, it will tell them what the anticipated civilian casualties are. And so, for each of these strikes, Israel has a very good understanding of what they think the civilian harm is going to be for each of these strikes. And so I think it's quite shocking when we see the high number of casualties for some of these very mid-level, Hamas leaders. Well, it's quite shocking, and to understand.
Maybe the signal at my end breaking up a bit. I missed just the last bit there. One other thing that also strikes me, I think the Pentagon stated that half munitions being dropped on Gaza were not guided in any way, so they're not precision bombs.
Yeah, that's really a huge problem and a grave concern. So at this point now, it's been reported that about 30,000 bombs have been dropped by Israel on Gaza. Now, we have two issues with the weapons that are being dropped, the types, right? One, upwards of half of them are unguided. So you're talking about 15,000 weapons falling on Gaza, one of the densest parts of the world, right? A city that's 1/3 the size of London, absorbing, 30,000 bombs, half of which are unguided. The problem with that is unguided weapons are much more likely to miss their target. Now, a precision weapon has a 3-meter error, so they're incredibly accurate and they don't miss by much. An unguided munition, however, has upwards of a 30-meter error. And that could be the difference between striking a Hamas leader and hitting an apartment building, 30 meters away that's filled with a Palestinian family. And we're seeing such high numbers of civilian casualties that there is concern that the use of these unguided munitions are contributing. But more than that, we're also seeing an incredibly large number of the largest weapons that Israel has in its arsenal being used. So the 2,000-pound bomb is one of the most common that we're seeing in this conflict. It's been reported that the vast majority of weapons that Israel is dropping are 2,000-pound munitions. And when you look at the blast and fragmentation radius, right, the lethal effects of each bomb, you have a huge area. So when the bomb strikes, the 2,000-pound bomb it creates a massive seismic effect, right, when it hits the earth. I've spoken to victims and witnesses who've said that they feel like they're surfing on the ground because the earth is just turned into liquid. Within about 12 meters, you're going to have a crater. Within 30 meters, you're going to have a massive blast wave, and that blast wave is going to kill anyone within the blast area. But then upwards of 300 to 350 meters, you're going to have lethal fragments fly out. And this is a humongous area when you consider areas of Gaza City where homes are just right on top of each other. And so it becomes very difficult for us to see how they can conduct a conflict like this with distinction when you have these wide area effects where even if you hit your target, those wide area effects will invariably envelop the civilian population.
I'd love to take some questions now. I've got the question coming up from Alan Livingston, who's in Houston, in Texas. So we'll take a question from Alan first. And please do, everyone, put your questions in the Q&A box. If you put your question in the Q&A box, we'll pose it directly to Mark. Go ahead, Alan.
Yes, my question is, after you document these incursions and these problems, what is the next step in getting them up to the authority like the United Nations or the World Court or wherever they're going, where attribution can be attributed to the country and maybe some results can be obtained?
Yeah, that is a great question, Alan. Thanks so much. So I think we need to understand that there are a number of levels of organizations that investigate war crimes, and each of those different levels have their evidentiary standards, right? So at the top, you have the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court sends out teams to investigate at the highest level of evidentiary standard, and everything that they take can then be brought directly to a court. But a decision to open a case has to be made. And there's an awful lot of politics that plays into this. And we have seen, for example, in Afghanistan, the US pushed very hard for the ICC not to investigate US actions in Afghanistan for potential war crimes. And in fact, the president of the United States at the time put in sanctions against ICC personnel. So even when the ICC is able to conduct investigations, powerful states can, in fact, make it very difficult for them. Then at the next level, you have commissions of inquiry that the UN puts together. And these are sent to specific conflicts, such as Syria, Libya, etc. And they will collect their information, and they can provide that to the ICC and others. They're at a little bit of a lower evidentiary standard because they're trying to get their information as quickly as possible and try to get things to the ICC, perhaps before ICC investigators can get there, and assist the ICC in their investigation. And then at the third and the lowest level, you would have UN missions, such as the mission in South Sudan, UNMISS, and they have personnel from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights who conduct their investigations. And they then push things upwards in their regular reporting. But the bottom line, Alan, is that regardless of the evidence that we take in and push forward to different states or inquiries, they can be held back. And it's come to the point now where various countries are saying, we've had enough. And we understand that the ICC is not going to be able to bring a war crimes case. So we're going to use what's called universal jurisdiction. And thus far, Germany has been really at the forefront of this, saying that if an individual comes into our country and they are believed to be a war criminal, we will seize them and put them on trial. And thus far, Germany has very successfully tried a number of Syrians for war crimes and war crimes cases.
Here's the question. Can you ever see Israel being put before that process in Western courts or before the ICC?
Yeah, no, it's very difficult, obviously, for me to see something like that. And it's
but why?
Reasons, right? Look,
why?
So first of all, because there is no history of it, all right? We've had a number of conflicts. I worked in Gaza during Operation Cast Lead, and there were a number of incidents I investigated that were put forward as potential war crimes and never went forward in the past. And so one would have to wonder why that's going to change today. But the biggest reason is clearly because the United States protects Israel at the Security Council, and therefore it's very difficult to see how that would ever go before a tribunal. That said, a state could use universal jurisdiction, and so any Israelis that are currently operating in this conflict that conduct war crimes that travel to those states could be then taken and tried, and Hamas as well, right? So Hamas individuals, let's say, that are able to get away at some point, travel through Egypt, and then go to another state, they could also be taken and tried for war crimes using universal jurisdiction. Let's not forget that Hamas is also a party to this conflict, and any war crimes that they have committed also need to be taken seriously and investigated and prosecuted.
Absolutely. I mean, I must say I'd be in favor of both, large numbers of senior leaders within Hamas being taken to the ICC as well as Israeli commanders. I know I'll be condemned for saying either one of those things. In a second, I want to come to George Muir's question, which is a good question, but I want to raise something that some people may not have heard of. And Mark, I don't know if you're aware of it. Are you aware of the Dahiya Doctrine that came out of the Lebanon War?
I was in the Dahiya during the Lebanon War. Well, I don't know the doctrine.
Dahiya is an area which is a Hezbollah stronghold in South Beirut.
South Beirut,
South Beirut. And in the 2006 conflict, that became the big focus for the IDF. And I want to I'm going to share my screen. And this article comes from, I think, 2008. So I'm going to share this here. And it's written by an IDF colonel who was very close to the chief of staff, who's now the advisor to Benjamin Netanyahu. And it's called, literally, this is the title, Disproportionate Force, Israel's Concept of Response in Light of the Second Lebanon War. And it basically says that the IDF has learned that in order to try and dispel or discourage an opponent from attacking, you should inflict disproportionate damage on their political leadership, but also their civilian infrastructure. And it's outlined, I'll go right down to the bottom of the article, where it specifically mentions Gaza as well. This approach is applicable to the Gaza Strip as well. The IDF should not expect to stop rocket and missile fire against the Israeli home front through attacks on the launchers themselves, but by means of imposing a ceasefire on the enemy. And it says here, the IDF's primary goal must nonetheless to attain a ceasefire on the conditions that will increase Israel long-term deterrence, prevention of a war of attrition, and leaving the enemy floundering in expensive long-term processes of reconstruction. So as it says, it's a doctrine that some argue has now become current IDF policy that talks specifically of a use of disproportionate force. Do you think that meets with the IDF's operations in Gaza? And then I think I'll leave George Muir to ask that question too. George, you're there. Go ahead, ask your question. George Muir, can you open your microphone? No, I think George is having problems opening his microphone. So there's my question.
Hello.
Oh, so go on, George.
Is it fair to say that Israel is in fact not trying to limit destruction?
Yeah.
And may I have a follow-up at the end of this one?
Yeah, sure. So Mark, go on, and then we'll come back to George.
Yeah, no, I think it is very fair to say that they're not limiting their destruction. I think that 20,000 dead Palestinians speaks directly to that, as well as 90% of the population being displaced from their homes, and a high percentage of the Gaza Strip already being turned to rubble. You know, what homes are there for folks to return to? I think that we've seen an excessive use of force throughout the Gaza Strip in this conflict, and you know it's horrible. And I would hope that we would have a ceasefire as soon as possible. George, what's your follow-up?
My follow-up is an entirely different one. Unrelated, but one of my historical heroes is Oliver Cromwell, and he has a bad rap for his behaviour in Ireland. But the proposition in Ireland is that his brutality in the sort of murder of civilians in the first town he took, I forget the name, saved a lot of lives later on because people surrendered more readily. Is there an analogy between Oliver Cromwell and what's going on in Gaza?
You know, it's really interesting, George. There are definitely those in the military that I speak with that have this idea that the harder the war is, the more people that get killed, the quicker that it ends. And unfortunately, I've seen the exact opposite. You know, if we look at what happened in the UK during the Blitz. The Germans, you know, dropped many tons of bombs on the UK. And what did it do? Did the British people, you know, sit down and say, "Oh, we're gonna surrender to Hitler"? No, it hardened them and made them fight back harder. You know, there were fire bombings on Japan, and it really took until the nuclear explosions that finally ended that. It's really difficult for me to look at conflicts and say, oh, you know, here's one where just because of the horrible destruction that they surrendered. I mean, look what the United States did to Vietnam during the Vietnam War, right? More bombs than we've ever dropped anywhere. And that war continued until they finally defeated us. So I don't see any conflict in which when a state violates the laws of war, is so forceful and hard on the civilian
Mark, have you
population.
seen any destruction similar to this? I mean, I'm thinking of Mosul in northern Iraq. That was, I think, possibly 10,000 civilian dead. The other comparison I've read is Dresden at the end of the Second World War, 25,000 civilian dead with about 2 months of bombing. Can you think that there can't be anything else within your lifetime?
Well, no, I mean, there are certainly instances that are reminiscent of what's going on in Gaza. So, for example, the fighting in Raqqa in 2017, when the city was basically leveled by a combination of U.S. airstrikes and artillery, et cetera, and Mosul as well. But that was a little bit different. A lot of artillery from the Iraqis and a lot of airstrikes. The big difference, though, in those two cities, while they were both rubbleized, is that the population had somewhere to go, right? They could escape. And that's not the case in Gaza, right? No matter what happens in Gaza, how many buildings you drop, the population's got nowhere. And now the Israelis have been providing these, so-called safe zones, and then they bomb the safe zones. And so it's very difficult for me to understand how that in any way comports with international humanitarian law.
It's quite remarkable to see both Syria and Afghanistan as more advantageous to being in Gaza, but there you go. Hilary Matthews, you've got a good follow-up question there too. Go on, Hilary. Hilary, you need to open your microphone.
There, can you hear me?
There you go.
Yeah.
Yep.
The British press always prefaces the casualty figures in Gaza saying that they come from the Hamas authorities. Israel says those figures are vastly exaggerated. How accurate do you believe those figures are, the 19,000 dead? And also, I wonder about the efficacy of the ICC when the US is not party to it, and I'm not sure whether Israel is or not.
Yeah, so when it comes to the number of dead, I can honestly say that is an undercount. Not only is it a reflection of as accurate a count as they can do, but it is easily an undercount. I have worked on done counts for the United Nations in a variety of conflicts, and you have to understand you only count where you can get to. There are many people whose bodies are not found for a very long time. And so whatever count you're able to do is very typically far fewer than what it actually is.
But Mark, I think the point is that the statistics that are being put out, you're saying they're an underestimate, but even those themselves, you're implying there that there is validity to them, and why is that?
Oh, absolutely. Well, the health authorities in Gaza have a very good history of very accurate body counts, and the U.S. State Department, for example, uses those numbers and speaks quite highly of them. When you look at a comparison of organizations like the Human Rights Watch counts in prior conflicts and Amnesty International, they're very close to the counts that the authorities in Gaza put out, up until, further work is done and bodies are found.
So is it fair to say it's like a ministry which has a civil service, and it could be Fatah in charge, it could be Hamas in charge, it could be whoever in charge, you've still got people doing a job, a proper job?
I mean, look, it's kind of like saying the Democratic-led medical establishment in the United States, or the Tory-led medical establishment in the United Kingdom. It's not reality. Just because a political party is in charge doesn't mean that they're running the counts.
Yeah. Okay. And what about? I mean, Hilary's follow-up there is the U.S., as we've discussed earlier, is not party to the ICC, nor is Israel. So we adjust that to a degree in the previous question, and I guess this comes back to the fact that neither of them are. The other point is that cases are dealt with by a court. If there's so for example, if Israel deals with Hamas and is deemed to have had fair trials, that doesn't have to be dealt with by the ICC.
That's right, and it's a really great point, and I appreciate you bringing that up. So the idea of the ICC is when a state is either unwilling or unable to conduct a war crime investigation. So, for example, let's say that a United States soldier commits a potential war crime. They don't need to go to the ICC, right? Because the U.S. has the Universal Code of Military Justice, and we do put people in jail for war crimes. And unfortunately, then you have President Trump pardoning them for war crimes, but that's a completely separate issue. But we do have a very solid military justice system, as does the United Kingdom and many countries in the West. The problem is, though, when you have countries like Russia, right, like Syria, where they don't have that kind of military justice system, nor would they care to put someone on trial for war crimes within their country. And in fact, unfortunately, sometimes would be very happy for those war crimes to be committed. So yeah, that becomes the issue. Now, what happens in Israel when you have a country that has a functioning judiciary and also has a functioning investigative body for its military, but then either ignores it for their own troops or refuses to take on those cases? That's an area where then the ICC would hopefully take a look. And the ICC has jurisdiction through the Palestinian case, where the Palestinians had asked them to come in and conduct investigations. But are you ever going to get access to those people, right? To a Netanyahu or someone else, or a ground commander for potential war crimes? I mean, it's just as difficult to see how the ICC would get a hold of a Hamas commander, right, for example. So I'm not saying it's easy, but it's what we've got. You have to understand, right? Everything that we're talking about is because this is how states have built our current international justice system, because they want their militaries to have a certain leeway to operate in a certain manner. And this is what we've been given. And, we have to work with the cards that we have.
So that comes back to a much broader question, which is, and it comes back to the beginning of our discussion, which is how the laws of war have been treated. And the premise that I had was that they're being broken down. What is your assessment in this era of populism, in era of increased conflict? We see the sort of post-Cold War era moving away from that, the end of history phase into an era of increased uncertainty. So what's your assessment when it comes to these laws of war?
I mean, look, unfortunately, I'm terribly busy, right? I mean, just look, I'm 53 years old. I've worked in Afghanistan, Gaza a number of times, the Republic of Georgia, Iraq, Libya, Serbia, Syria, Myanmar, Israel, the list goes on. It's mind-boggling, right? So I'm not going out of business, unfortunately, and neither are the war criminals. And I think we need to understand that for those of us who work in human rights and in war crimes investigations, that you need to have a long view of things, right? It did take a long time to get some of the Serbian leaders, for example. It does take a long time to get some of these individuals, but it is a very difficult job for us. Obviously, it becomes very hard on your psyche when you work diligently on an investigation, knowing that it may never see the light of day. And it's tough on victims, right? Where is the justice for the victims? And that being one of the most important things. And then additionally, and more to your question, Nicholas, is what is the effect on the deterrent effect if war crimes are just allowed to happen? Right? If we don't deal with them in a strong way. We have instances where if you don't investigate Russian war crimes in Syria, the Russians then say, hey, nothing's going to happen to us in Ukraine, right? If you don't investigate potential war crimes in Gaza in 2009 during Cast Lead, or in 2014 during that operation, potentially you have that again in this conflict. And so it does paint a bit of a dire picture. I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you, but I also think it's important that we do have these laws and that we continue to move forward with them. But it also shows that there are times when we have to look outside of the established laws of war and maybe work in a different angle. So, for example, the mine ban treaty that was put forward in Canada, and is now signed by almost the entire world. The cluster bomb treaty of 2008, the very recent treaty on nuclear weapons. These are all important international treaties, but they were negotiated outside of the UN system by states that brought them, but that came together to negotiate them, and then eventually deposited them in the UN for final adjudication. But they were
that was not on the
outside of the
cluster
system.
munitions. That's essentially because the US wouldn't sign up to it. Had the US been behind it, that might have been, had the UN backing from the outset, it might have been adopted as a UN agreement. Let's picking up on that. Let's take a question from Marty Ryan, and then another one from Alan Livingston and Diane Cook. So Marty, you go ahead with your question.
Yeah, this is a hot button thing for me. I'm in the US, and the US, we commit crimes against humanity every single day and at home. And yet we're big voices about crimes against humanity outside our country. So,
sorry, Marty, can you just clarify what do you mean by crimes against humanity at home? Just be a bit more specific.
We have police brutality. We have, that's probably the biggest one, but we also have institutionalized and structural racism that continues to violate people's human rights. Investigation and search and seizure, violates the amendment. So, and we, of course, we never signed on to the International Criminal Court. So my question is, how do you see the U.S. as, what is our responsibility and what is our accountability to the world in intervening to try to bring a stop to the wars, at least
You're saying how able is the U.S. to do it? And
what should we be doing? I mean, there's a lot of opinions around the country about we should stop sending arms to Israel as one of the ways to get the Israelis to stop all this.
I guess as an investigator, Mark, it's difficult for you to have a sort of policy position on this. But
right, but I can definitely speak to one angle that Marty raises, and I appreciate it, Marty, is that we do have laws on the books on how we should treat our allies and partners that we provide weapons to. So, for example, we have two very effective if they were implemented, right? One is the Leahy Law, and the Leahy Law states that we cannot provide weapons to another country if we are concerned that they're going to commit human rights abuses with it. And according to the Leahy Law, the State Department has to look at and authorize each weapon transfer by investigating the units that we're going to provide them to and make sure that they're not human rights abusers. The problem is this is very rarely implemented and is quite weak. There's a new statute that was just put on the books in 2023. I'm really sorry, the acronym is horrible. It's the CHIRG. And I'm sorry if I don't remember off the top of my head. It's the CHIRG, the Civilian Harm, I think, Incident Review Guidance, something like that. It's a new State Department policy just put into effect. And the CHIRG states that if U.S. weapons are used in a human rights violation, that it must be investigated by the U.S., and then we potentially will stop providing munitions to those countries. And we will see if that is applied in the Gaza situation. I don't hold a lot of hope, but we do have laws on the books if we desire to actually apply them.
I want to mirror that inversely with the reaction in the UK. So I can't imagine Congress allowing the DOD to investigate that. I think they would put a stop to it. I think the pro-Israel lobby in Congress would put a stop to those kind of investigations. In the UK, you've seen a retreat from a commitment to international treaties that to hold up, the Human Rights Convention, for example, they'd want to move away from with the Conservative government. They had a defense review which deleted all the references to a rules-based international order. There were actually the 2021 version of that the integrated review of security, defense, and foreign policy had no references at all to that rules-based order. So there's an idea of the direction of travel. I want to contrast that with an era in the late 1990s. So Alan Livingston, you've got a question that sort of brings up, I think, a different point. Alan Livingston, go ahead with your second question. You need to open your microphone.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yes, I'm curious, what was different in the way the war crimes in Serbia were successfully prosecuted against Milosevic and General Gotovina, and others? And what kind of precedents was set that might be used to further war crimes prosecutions in the future?
Yeah, so unfortunately, those were the results of power politics. You had a new government elected into Serbia that very much wanted to be accepted in Western Europe, and the price for them was to give up these war criminals. And so they agreed. They provided Milosevic and others to the courts. And, look, everyone knew for a long time where Slobodan Milosevic and others were. And they were always held and protected by the Serbs. But it really came to a point when they wanted to have a certain acceptance within Western Europe, access to different markets, et cetera. And so that's basically what happened. Unfortunately, we don't have a very good cases outside of the African continent where we regularly grab war criminals and put them on trial, and that's also a concern with the ICC and the way war crimes cases go. Right, it's very much seen, I think, in the Southern Hemisphere as something that does not affect countries in the Northern Hemisphere. Right, and I think to date that's very true.
Diane Cook, a very good follow-up to this. So go ahead with your question, Diane Cook.
Excuse me. Mark, are we coming to the conclusion, going back to Russia and Ukraine, that the only way to get Russia accountable for its war of aggression is actually for it to be utterly defeated?
Well,
victor's justice.
That certainly is one potential. I think it's going to be very difficult to see how we would get Vladimir Putin, for example, without some kind of a victor's justice. But I definitely can tell you this: we have a very good understanding of who is in a variety of positions in the Russian military, making the decisions on many of the strikes that are occurring in civilian areas. Who are those in the targeting shop? Who are those in various leadership positions? So that should those people ever travel outside of Russia, I believe very quickly, via a red notice, they will be snatched up.
But here's the hypocrisy of that situation, Mark. Yeah. We know exactly the same, probably even better, when it comes to the IDF.
Well, those are the political decisions that are made by powerful countries. I'm not going to argue with you on that, but I still think that it's important what we do, and the investigations, getting the truth out, trying to get to the bottom of things, not doing an assessment that's based on hearsay. Look, for example, on that strike on the hospital in the very first week of the war in Gaza, there was a lot of back and forth. And I very quickly stepped forward and said, based on the forensic evidence that's being shown at the site, it does in fact look like it was a Hamas rocket, that it was not an IDF weapon. And I took a bit of heat for it, but you have to stand there and you have to speak the truth. There's no point in trying to spin it some other way for some political reasons, right? And stand up for the truth. When Israel doesn't commit a war crime and Hamas does, you have to stand there and say it. And there has to be justice on all sides.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. It's been a really good discussion. Thank you very much, everyone, for your questions. Do stay on the line, everyone, too. We're going to have a brief discussion afterwards, and also a quick look at the talks and tours coming up as well. So, Marc Garlasco, thank you very much indeed. And apologies, everyone, for the beginning of the discussion. Yeah. Mark had stitches in his hand, and the hospital were very late in terms of taking him up. But we are very grateful for him speeding all the way home and getting back. I'm
so sorry. I really am. That we had plenty of time planned, and then the doctor just was more and more delayed. I just want to say to everyone, I really appreciate you hanging in there with me, and all the best.
It was a great discussion. Thank you very much indeed, Mark.